folks, Kevin here. How are you folks doing today? I'm doing pretty well. I'm pretty excited about spring starting to show. More of the snow is melting out there. It's March 30th, and for me this is one of the best times of life, is when everything starts emerging. And 2 days ago I made a presentation that's already shown by now on my use of cardboard and various paper products, and I won't go into detail. I'll put a link up here, I think it is, or up there, to that video. And I anticipate there's going to be a lot of responses, potentially, or at least people saying, oh my god, this guy's nuts, he's putting all this toxic waste into his soil and all. And I'll produce more videos talking about really sources that you have to worry about bringing onto your property, and I'll cover that, I think, at least superficially, so that you can be aware of some of the subject matter. However, today I wanted to give you a little bit of a teaser of some of the science behind what I'm talking about, because I've used some terms: bioremediation, phytoremediation, and mycoremediation. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this little mind map presentation in a minute or so. So if you do have questions after this, please use Google Scholar, and just in the Google search engine search for Scholar, and that'll bring up Google Scholar, and then do some thoughtful research on whatever the subject matter is, because you're going to be getting lots of peer-reviewed articles, scientific literature on whatever topic it is. Whether we're talking about precious metals in waste products, like in our computer products and so on, there's a whole variety of things and all. And the things you're going to see in future videos that I'm doing around the site, and I'm using these terms, I at least would like you to be able to refer back to this video so you can at least have the words written out, a little definition, and give you a little more insight as to, geez, there's science behind this whole process. This is, I guess my point here is, the days of incinerations and landfill are rapidly approaching an end. I know right now in the United States, we've got a president and Congress that it's hell-bent on, using piping oil all over, and there's going to be water pollution as a result of it, more than what we've already had. And in a future video, I'll tell you why they're doing it. It's for potentially tremendous financial gain, and not directly related to the oil. But that's another video. But how do we do it? How do we take ownership of those waste products that we create in our household, or that are already on the land that we purchase, or we help others, or even inside of our house? We'll have future videos on how to deal with those waste products that we're using to clean the house, clean our toilets, the beauty products we're putting on our bodies, the deodorants we're using. There's things that potentially are mutagenic or carcinogenic or endocrine disruptors, all of those things. And all of these things can be bioremediated. They can put back into either a good form or an inert form. But anyways, without any further introduction, I think it's time to go to the mind map. I hope you folks enjoy this. Have a great day. So let's deal with waste. Let's start off. Today we're talking about toxic waste. So what is it? It's any liquid, gas, or solid that can, if it's inhaled or swallowed or absorbed, causes harm. What are some sources for these toxic waste products? Well, industry, agriculture, motor vehicles, sewage, military, and our own trash. In our own household, as a matter of fact. What are types of toxic waste? Well, they're both organic and inorganic. There's heavy metals, there's radionuclides, there's nitrates, phosphates, and animal waste products, there's pesticides, there's explosives, and there's hydrocarbons. What are the goals for dealing with pollution? Well, first and foremost, we want to try and prevent it if at all possible, and reduce it if we can't prevent it. And certainly we have to identify those sources of toxic waste, or those sites that are contaminated, and clean up that pollution. So what are the cleanup technologies? Well, historically, we used mechanical and chemical means of dealing with toxic waste. So we would excavate sites, we'd transport it, we'd wash it, we'd do chemical reactions, incinerate it, bury it. We'd use dispersing agents such as in oil spills and all. We'd use aerosols and water treatment bubbling systems. Geez, what's one of the problems with it? Well, it produces hazardous byproducts. Yes, some of our waste management systems produces carcinogens that go into our air with incinerators, producing polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, known carcinogens. There's disinfectant byproducts in our municipal water supply, which are known carcinogens. So this isn't the greatest system, and it's energy intensive. It's expensive. What about biological means of dealing with toxic waste? Well, it uses solar energy. A lot of this is plant-based. It's relatively inexpensive, and transportation is not ordinarily necessary. It can be done on site in many cases. Not always. If we've got a large contaminated site, sometimes we want to do some transportation to or modification of a site in order to deal with a large, well, what we would call before a Superfund site, where lots of hazardous waste products have been dumped and have contaminated the soil and the aquifer. All right, so now we can use both mechanical and biological systems. Those are ones where we're using the microorganisms, the plants, and we're creating, living systems, which we'll talk a bit more about. This bioremediation, this is one of those terms that I keep using. So what is it? It's using organisms to clean up pollutants. That's what bioremediation is. It's using living things to clean up pollutions. Microorganisms alone is one way. Phytoremediation is using plants, and you can be using plants and their associated microorganisms because plants don't do very much totally on their own. They need the microorganisms in the soil to help them, or in the water. So what are the mechanisms of biotransformation? Well, there's phytodegradation. That means that the plants themselves are actually taking up these waste products, these pollutants, and breaking them down in the plants themselves. The plants actually degrade them. Sometimes they don't even have to take them all the way up and get up into the leaves themselves, but the plant has the ability to do it. What about phytoextraction? This is an interesting one. The plants are able to remove many dangerous or toxic elements, including most heavy metals. They're also called hyperaccumulators. The pollutant is harvested in the plant tissue. So some industrious entrepreneurs go ahead and places where there's certain metals, such as gold, nickel, copper, zinc, and so on, can actually have the plants take up these metals and then go ahead, harvest the plants, and extract them through various means. Phytovolatilization. That's the uptake, modification, and transpiration of contaminants. Primarily, these are organic compounds. They're released into the air in a volatile form through transpiration. Those little pores on the leaf surface that allow the moisture and volatile organic compounds to be released into the atmosphere. Now there's phytostabilization. This really is keeping the contaminants right in a specific location. So for example, the heavy metals, and this should be done at many of the mining sites around the country, to keep those contaminants from getting into the aquifer and being released into other environments as well. So that's where the pollutant is immobilized, where the phytostabilization, the pollutant is immobilized in the soil. And that may be just the first step of bioremediating the organisms in a second follow-up stage. And I'll talk a little bit about some ongoing research that's going on as well. How about phytostimulation? Well, that's where we're working with the root zone or the rhizosphere, where there's enhanced microbial activity as a result of the plant stimulating the microbes that are associated with the roots in these plants.
And so the plant roots actually stimulate the associated microbes to degrade the pollutants. The pollutants are, excuse me, the pollutants are removed from the water by the plant root in aquaponic systems. There's actually some nice photographs you can look online that show the appearance of the roots in areas where these where the roots are just completely associated. But again, these are in aquaponic systems, and it's the microbes that are associated with the plant root system that are actually doing this work with the plant. So what about mycoremediation? You've heard me talk about this in some of the videos. Well, that's using fungi and their associated microorganisms. So certainly fungi can break down all of those paper products and some of those plastic products that I've been talking about in recent videos. So there's various types of bioremediations. One is a bioreactor. So that's an apparatus where they put the microbes inside of a contained system, and the pollutants are biodegraded in this controlled environment. Methane would be a good example. Excuse me. There are permaculturists that are taking animal waste or human waste and producing methane and powering their generators and their stoves. So those are ways of utilizing bioremediation and creating a controlled environment to produce a desirable gas. Then there's soil composting. Well, it's just like composting, it's just that you're taking the soil and putting it in a large pile, and these can be in covered buildings or they can be out in the open and just a tarp over them. And it's similar to composting, and you're just introducing the microbes that break down the toxic waste products. And depending on which microbes, the environment and all, this may work for certain contaminants and not others. Then there's the land treatment, almost like lasagna gardening, to go ahead and introduce the appropriate microbes into various layers of the contaminated soil. Then there's in situ bioremediation. Well, sometimes the waste, we just can't get at it because it's deep, it's buried deep underground, or it's in the aquifer down below, and it requires drilling or piping and a circulatory system being put in, and the water or the contaminants, the water being cycled through biological reactors similar to what we talked about first in bioreactors, and then that effluent from that system being pumped back down into the subsurface where the oil, where the contaminant is located. Bioaugmentation is where we're taking actually some of the cultured microorganisms and putting them through that circulatory system. But again, they have to be very specific, nutrient dependent on the waste product that's there in order to do that biotransformation and clean up those contaminants. So I mentioned the living machine previously in this presentation. I've mentioned John Todd in a few of my talks in the past. And John, if you Google John Todd Ecologic Design or Omega Center for Sustainable Living in Rhinebeck, New York, he's got many different systems, several systems where there's YouTube videos, and you can look him up and see some of the fantastic work he's been doing. So basically, we can take an environment, take a community, and deal with all of the waste that's produced from that community, put it through these living systems, and take our urine and feces, biotransform all of the negative things that we're worried about, all of the pathogens, all of the waste products. It goes through various systems and have clean drinking water at the other side, and have good produce that we can consume as well. It's creating an Eden in communities, and this is being done in different centers. Mycology. Certainly, Peter McCoy of Radical Mycology is one of those people who's been introduced to many of the permaculture society. And that's how I found out about Peter McCoy and the Radical Mycology group. This guy has made some very good videos. He's recently published a full thick book, one that I probably won't be purchasing unless we get somebody to put it on Audible. Excuse me, one of my cats is excited here. And so his work is just phenomenal, and he's created some great YouTube videos to be seen as well. And he's also created a downloadable PDF, Adobe Acrobat introduction to radical mycology as well. So that some of the techniques that he's demonstrated, I've employed on site as well. Then there's Paul Stamets, lists 6 ways that mycelium can save the universe. And there's TED Talks about it. Now, Paul Stamets is a pretty famous mycologist. He's pretty far out there as far as most people would think. He, again, is one of my heroes as far as disseminating qualitative information on the resources that are available to us in our environment to have a positive impact and help us reduce toxic waste products. Excuse me, I don't know how I just did that. So making it work and making it better. So first we have to identify the climate and the appropriate species of microorganisms or plants that can deal with that plant, that can perform the bioremediation. So we really have to observe our site, what the contaminants are, and determine what are the best means of dealing with that. So we can manipulate the environment in certain ways. So we can make alterations to the slope. We can make sort of like what I've been doing here is creating these hugelkultur type mounds that can deviate the slope. You can create swales as well. So there's means of dealing with our environment that can help us bioremediate the organisms. And as I mentioned before, sometimes we want to do we want to stabilize those contaminants in one area and prevent runoff. And if we have a steep slope, that's one of the first things we got to do before we try remediating it. We need to stabilize it, phytostabilization first. So what about the soils and substrates? We need to know, do we have predominantly clay or do we have mostly gravel? On our site we have a lot of gravel, so that has tremendous porosity and water can go through that rapidly. So we need to be aware of that. We can easily get fluid into the aquifer on a site like ours. Whereas in a heavily clay site, well, it's going to create more of a barrier for those those pollutants to get into the aquifer. So realizing what we're dealing with on site. Certainly water flow rates. Do we have water on site? Do we have the water moving too rapidly? So we may have to mitigate the water flow rate. What about the wind and airflow to the site, depending on what microorganism and which bioremediation system we're using? What about solar exposure? So fungi, breaking down the cardboard and paper products, you see I'm going into the woods because the fungi don't need the sunlight exposure. But the bioremediation systems that you've seen, the marginal zones around the ponds and canal systems I put in, they're in full sun exposure because those plants need the solar radiation in order for the plants to do their bioremediation. What about temperature? Well, we're in a cold temperate climate. Being too cold can be a hindrance. We may have to put, if we're going to have a community system, we may need to build greenhouses or have these in controlled environments inside of insulated buildings in really cold zones to keep the bioremediation organisms at optimal efficiency. What about the nutrient requirements for the bioremediators that are there as well? What about the companion plants or building guilds that allow us to stage the transformation? Because some of the biological transformation stages, there's several steps that to take the initial toxic waste product and transform it into something that's easily utilized and either inert or as an input to feeding other systems. What about inoculants? Are we going to need inoculants with the paper and cardboard and the plastics that I've talked about? We're using some of the nature's inoculants in the woodland areas, and when I find areas that are breaking down the plastics, I'm going ahead and using that as an inoculant for the next system that's going to have some of the plastics in it as well. What about chelation, such as biochar? Chelation is like the adsorption, not absorption with a B, but adsorption with a D. So chelation can hold up and trap, in a sense, some charged, appropriately sized hazardous waste products as well. So in the future, now, you'll hear in other videos, I'm very much against what's being done with genetically engineered organisms or genetically modified organisms this day and age. And it's because I believe that there hasn't been the appropriate labeling and there hasn't been the extensive research that needs to be done before the companies have taken over and released these into the market. Having said that, I believe that genetic engineering is quite possibly one of the ways that we're going to be able to bioremediate all sorts of things in the future, pollutants that we aren't even aware of. There's nanotechnology that's going to create environmental issues. We see some of the microscopic plastic or polyesters that are being released into the waters as well, and we have the small degradation byproducts of the plastics that are in our oceans and affecting many of the aquatic species that are there. So genetic engineering certainly is potentially a viable means of facing hazardous waste products in the future, and helping us to clear up some of the hazardous waste sites that we phytostabilize. We trap them in that site now, and but again, all of this is being done so that we can realize that incinerators and our current waste treatment systems and our landfills are a thing of the past. And it all starts with us becoming aware and also taking action. So us dealing with reducing the amount of packaging that we're taking home with us, reducing the amount of materials that's going into the landfills. No food waste products, no organic materials should be going into landfills or incinerators. That is just creating hazardous waste, toxic waste. All of these materials should be composted. I know that flies in the face of what people say about recycling cardboard and paper products and all. I'd like to see us get away from using tree products for those materials, but these materials need to go back into the soil. We need to sequester the carbon and utilize it for many of these other organisms. So I hope that this has been somewhat helpful in giving you some of the terms that I think are important to understand, and it gives you some terms that you can use Google Scholar to research further. And when you see me making some of my videos and talking about some of these chemicals and all, you can refer back to this video and do some research with it, and then we can have some meaningful discussions. I'd really like to see us as communities grow, and we can have absolutely meaningful and beneficial discussions that can help guide us in our own ability to deal with our own waste. Well, thanks so much for watching the video, folks. I really appreciate it. Please give us a thumb up if you think that this was valuable. Please share it with your friends, and remember, subscribe if you haven't subscribed if you think this information is valuable to you. Thanks so much and have a great day, folks. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye now.